All right, so let's go ahead and go through the different kinds of plugs as well as the different kinds of wire, the SPT1 and the SPT2. SPT, not SB, but SPT. So there's two different types of wire that you're going to come across. So one is an SPT2, which is the thicker wire, okay? And then an SPT1. Okay, and here's kind of the difference. You guys can see that if I put them close together here, the difference in like the thickness here. So really, here's how it works. The SPT1 is an 18 gauge wire. The SPT2 is an 18 gauge wire in most cases from most suppliers. Okay, so really the only difference that you're going to see between the SPT1 and the SPT2 wire is the insulation. Okay, so again, if we're comparing apples to apples here in a way, the same gauge, right, then the only difference is going to be the insulation. So if you look at the SPT2, which is this one, it's got twice as much insulation as the SPT1. So when we ask ourselves, okay, well, what does it matter, or does it even matter, and what should I use, and why should I use it? Really, it just kind of depends. There's really not a right or a wrong answer, but let's just talk about the pros and cons of each of these, okay? So, obviously, if you've got more insulation in your wire, right, it's not going to get as hot. So this is actually something to consider. So when you're doing your maximum runs on a wire, it can start to get hot towards the plug, okay, because you're running so much electricity to the end and back, and it starts to get warm and it can heat up, okay. So more insulation in that case is better. Do you have to have it? No, but if you're, I would recommend this. So I've seen some pretty interesting things happen with wire. I've seen wire melt. I've seen wire catch on fire because it's too hot. So you really have to be careful about this. The last thing that you want to do is burn down someone's house, right? Or start a fire of any sort, okay? So it's really important and really critical that you stay within your load limits and the ratings for these wires, okay? I personally would not push the limits at all. And we'll talk specifically about that as well in this training. But that's our main difference between the SPT1 and 2. That's a big pro for the SPT2 is going to be the insulation, okay? Another pro for this is if you're going to be in climates that have some extreme weather, and it could even be hot or cold, but one thing that I've seen is, let's say you've ran your wire on a house and it gets really hot, so maybe Arizona. So I live in Denver, and we had like a 70-degree day in the winter, and we actually ended up having to go fix some stuff. We had trouble with one home that it overheated and it melted some of the wire. It was within our load limits. Everything as far as the ratings went was normal, but because of how hot it was outside, we were using SPT1 and it just got overheated, okay? So that's one thing. Another thing too, guys, is the NEC basically states that, if you're using an 18 gauge wire, that you shouldn't be using it more than 90 days. So it should be used more as like a seasonal application, right? Hence why Christmas light wire is 18 gauge, and it's SPT1 and 2. They recommend that you don't leave this up more than 90 days, okay? So if you're going to be leaving your lights up longer than that, I think an SPT2 wire would be safer. It's going to have more insulation. It's going to protect the wire better. It's going to last longer in those weather conditions. All right. So those are kind of the pros for the SPT2. SPT1, kind of the pro for this guy is it's cheaper. All right. So it's more cost effective to use the SPT1. Obviously, it's a little more environmentally friendly because you're using half of the product or plastic, right, to coat the wires. they both get the job done. I've used both. I use both. Smaller jobs, I've used the SPT-1. If I feel like we're going to be maximizing loads, I'll always go with the SPT-2. But having said that, here from my experience, and this is what I would recommend, I recommend that you would pick one or the other and you run with that consistently, because what you're going to run into is when you run two different types of wires, that means you're going to need two different types of plugs, and things can get messy and confusing. You got to be more organized. It's just not as efficient if you're running a bunch of different size wire. Okay, so if I could do it all over again, I would pick one size, just to simplify it, just to make it consistent, and I would run with that. Okay. All right, so those are kind of the pros and cons of the SPT-2, SPT-1. Really, it's just a choice you've got to make, but hopefully that'll help you make a decision. So professional installers use both. They go either way. It's just a preference that you have, and maybe the climate and how long you're going to have those lights up for. Okay, so if we look at this SPT, we'll just take this 2-wire. If you look at this side close, hopefully you can see that there's ridges along this edge of the wire. If we look at the other side, this side is smooth. Okay, so we've got a smooth side, we've got a ridged side. Okay, so that's important. We need to know that, because when we start to put on our Vampire plugs, all right, which are these, and if you look at these plugs inside, they've got these sharp teeth, these pointy teeth, and that's hence where they come with Vampire. But basically the way that it works is we're basically going to take our cord, all right, and we're going to put it in the plug, and we're going to basically, the Vampire teeth are going to pierce the copper wires, and that's going to flow electricity into the plug. Okay. All right, so let's get back to the rib side versus the smooth side. All right, when you look at these plugs, if you look inside, you've got a fatter side and a skinnier side, all right, on the female. If you look at the male, same thing, okay? You've got a fat side and you've got a skinnier side, all right? So the key is, when you use this, the wire, is you want the rib side to pierce the Vampire tooth of the fat prong, okay? So the Vampire tooth needs to pierce the prong to the fat side, all right, or the larger opening on the female side. Okay, so always remember the ribbed edge has got to go to the bigger opening on the female, or the fatter prong on the male side. All right. Okay, so the way that we use these plugs, the way that we put them together, is first we want to prep our wire. Okay, so we want to make sure that when we cut the wire, we've got a clean cut. So use some kind of a snip that's going to make a clean cut, all right? Because the reason we want it to be a clean cut is because if these wires end up grounding out, all right, then it's going to trip breakers, it's going to trip the GFI, all right, it's going to take our system down, okay? So we want to first make sure that we've got a clean cut, all right? So the second thing we want to do is separate these two wires a little bit from each other. This is the last 1/4 inch of the wire we want to separate. So you can do it a couple ways, right? You can take your snips and just, kind of snip the last 1/4 inch. You can also just take a knife and just kind of go down that edge, okay? And basically we just want to separate so these wires can be separated. The reason is because on our Vampire plug, when we go to insert this into the Vampire plug, at the bottom of the insertion, there's a plastic thing that kind of separates the wires, so it keeps them from coming together. All right, so that's why we want to separate that. So how this works is I'm going to look for the rib side, okay, and then I'm going to make sure that I've got the fat side. So in this case, I'm going to do a female plug. So this is the fat side. So if I flip it over, the Vampire prong is on the right. So I want to make sure that my rib is on the right side along with my Vampire prong on the right, okay? So, all right, so I'm just going to basically push this down all the way, okay? And then we're just going to fold it over. All right, so we can just kind of fold it over. I like to kind of compress these a little bit. And then what we've got is a cap, okay? So we can put this cap on, and it's got it does matter which way it goes. So on this side, it's an open face, this cap. And if you look on this other side, it's got this little barrier here. Okay, so the open face is how we're going to start inserting this. We're going to put the open face here. And basically, we're just going to compress this together. All right, so a lot of times it's good to carry like channel locks to do this. All right, but basically you just slide that on, and that's going to push the wires down into the vampire teeth and just make sure it's completely sealed. Okay. All right, so that's how you put a vampire. That's how you put a vampire plug on. So now this cord is ready to go. All right. Now there are different plugs for SPT1 and SPT2. Okay. So the difference is, let me see if you can see the difference here. If you look close, you're going to see some ridges that come in, basically narrow that gap, because again the SPT1 wire is more narrow. Okay, so if I put it in the SPT2 plug, there's lots of play. Okay, but the SPT1 is made, when you put it in, there's that wiggle room gets taken away. All right, so you shouldn't mix SPT1 with SPT2 wire. It's kind of tough to do it, but don't try to force it. The prongs are located in different spots. All right, or try to get an SPT1 wire to fit an SPT2 plug. Again, what you're going to find is trouble, which means that you're going to get a call back from your client because maybe your wire didn't quite get into the copper, the vampire tooth didn't get all the way into the copper, or maybe even slides out because it's not made correctly for it. Okay, so make sure you use the right plugs for the right wire. All right, so the big takeaway, guys, is when you start to wire these in and use these plugs, it's always critical to make sure you know where the ridged side is. Okay, so one little tip, guys, if you end up mixing and matching like SPT1 and 2 wires, so if you end up using both of the wires and then you're carrying SPT1 and SPT2 plugs like we are, and like I said, if I could do it over, I would just be consistent and go with one. It'd make life so much easier. Anyway, so what we've done is we started getting black SPT1 plugs and green SPT2 plugs. So that way we know exactly if it's a 1 or a 2 just by the color. Okay, so you can also buy black jump or zip wire, but we don't. We basically just buy the SPT1 plugs in black so that we know quickly if it's a 1 or a 2, and we're not sitting here trying to figure out, is that a 1 or a 2? I'm looking at it trying to figure out if the gaps are right or not. It just saves a lot of time, makes it a lot more efficient.